Hey everybody, how we doing? Inspector here. Been sitting on a couple pieces here I've been wanting to get out here as of late, and both of them going to have to do with cognitive abilities. Yeah, that's right, talking about hacking your brain. And a couple pieces came out in the last week or two that I think are important enough to share to kind of get on top of here and at least make you aware of. So that being said, let's get right into them. First of which, out of Zero Hedge, NATO's plan to hack your brain, authored by Ben Norton via the Gray Zone, came out, I think, actually on the 8th on the Gray Zone, so it's been out a while, but nonetheless, as Western governments in the NATO military alliance are developing tactics of cognitive warfare using the supposed threats of China and Russia to justify waging a battle for your brain in the human domain to make everyone a weapon. Yeah, let that sink in. This big psyop, and then think about the things we've got playing out right now and have been for the last 20 months or so. NATO is developing new forms of warfare to wage a battle for the brain, as the military alliance put it. The U.S.-led NATO military cartel has tested novel modes of hybrid warfare against its self-declared adversaries, including economic warfare, cyber warfare, information warfare, and psychological warfare. Now NATO is spinning out an entirely new kind of combat. It is branded cognitive warfare. Described as the weaponization of brain sciences, the new method involves hacking the individual by exploiting the vulnerabilities of the human brain in order to implement more sophisticated social engineering. Until recently, NATO had divided war into 5 different operational domains: air, land, sea, space, and cyber. But with its development of cognitive warfare strategies, the military alliance is discussing a new 6th level, the human domain. And I guess I'll pause here and remind us of things like Operation Jade Helm. This is eerily reminiscent of that just in the first few quips here of the battle in the human domain. Jade Helm 2015 has had a lot of similarities to this, so almost makes you wonder if it's resurrected and put forth to NATO in that respect. A 2020 NATO-sponsored study of this new form of warfare clearly explained, while actions taken in the 5 domains are executed in order to have an effect on the human domain, cognitive warfare's objective is to make everyone a weapon. The brain will be the battlefield of the 21st century, the report stressed. Humans are the contested domain, and future conflicts will likely occur amongst the people digitally first, and physically thereafter, in proximity to hubs of political and economic power. While the 2020-backed study insisted that much of its research on cognitive warfare is designed for defensive purposes, it also concedes that the military alliance is developing offensive tactics, stating, "The human is very often the main vulnerability, and it should be acknowledged in order to protect NATO's human capital, but also to be able to benefit from our adversaries' vulnerabilities." In a chilling disclosure, the report said explicitly that the objective of cognitive warfare is to harm societies and not only the military. With entire civilian populations in NATO's crosshairs, the report emphasized that Western militaries must work more closely with academia to weaponize social sciences and human sciences and help the alliance develop its cognitive warfare capacities. The study described this phenomenon as a militarization of brain science, but it appears clear that NATO's development of cognitive warfare will lead to a militarization of all aspects of human society and psychology, from the most intimate of social relationships to the mind itself. Such all-encompassing militarization of society is reflected in the paranoid tone of the NATO-sponsored report, which warned of an embedded 5th column, where everyone, unbeknownst to him or her, is behaving according to the plans of one of our competitors. The study makes it clear that those competitors purportedly exploiting the consciousness of Western dissidents are China and Russia. In other words, the document shows that figures in the NATO military cartel increasingly see their own domestic population as a threat, fearing civilians to be potential Chinese or Russian sleeper cells, dastardly fifth columns that challenge the stability of Western liberal democracies. NATO's development of novel forms of hybrid warfare come at a time when member states' military campaigns are targeting domestic populations on an unprecedented level. The Ottawa Citizen reported this September that the Canadian military's Joint Operations Command took advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to wage an information war against its own domestic population, testing out propaganda tactics on Canadian civilians. Think about that. You think any of those campaigns are going on, in any other country? Do you think Canada is the only one where that is playing out? Seriously? Internal NATO-sponsored reports suggest that this disclosure is just scratching the surface of a wave of new, unconventional warfare techniques that Western militaries are employing around the world. Canada hosts NATO Innovation Challenge on Cognitive Warfare. Twice each year, NATO holds a pitch-style event that it branded as an Innovation Challenge. These campaigns, one hosted in the spring and the other in the fall by alternating member states, call on private companies, organizations, and researchers to help develop new tactics and technologies for the military alliance. The Shark Tank-like challenges reflect the predominant influence of neoliberal ideology within NATO, as participants mobilize the free market, public-private partnerships, and the promise of cash prizes to advance the agenda of the military-industrial complex. NATO's Fall 2021 Innovation Challenge is hosted by Canada and is titled The Invisible Threat: Tools for Countering Cognitive Warfare. Can you solve it? Cognitive warfare seeks to change not only what people think, but also how they act. The Canadian government wrote in its official statement on the challenge, attacks against the cognitive domain involve the integration of cyber, disinformation, misinformation, psychological, and social engineering capabilities. Ottawa's press release continued. Cognitive warfare positions the mind as a battle space and contested domain. Its objective is to sow dissonance, instigate conflicting narratives, polarize opinion, and radicalize groups. Cognitive warfare can motivate people to act in ways that can disrupt or fragment an otherwise cohesive society. NATO-backed Canadian military officials discuss cognitive warfare in panel event. An advocacy group called the NATO Association of Canada has mobilized to support this innovation challenge, working closely with military contractors to attract the private sector to invest in further research on behalf of NATO and its own bottom line. While the NATO Association of Canada is technically an independent NGO, its mission is to promote NATO, and the organization boasts on its website. The NAOC has strong ties with the Government of Canada, including Global Affairs Canada and the Department of National Defence. As part of its effort to promote Canada's NATO Innovation Challenge, the NAOC held a panel discussion on cognitive warfare on October 5th. The researcher who wrote the definitive 2020 sponsored study on cognitive warfare, François de Clozel, participated in the event alongside NATO-backed Canadian military officers. And presumably these are some of those per Zoom call here. Says the October 5th panel on cognitive warfare hosted by NATO Association of Canada. The panel was overseen by Robert Baines, president of the NATO Association of Canada. It was moderated by Garrick Nagay, a marketing executive in the weapons industry who serves as an advisor to the Canadian Department of National Defence and Vice President and Director of the NAOC. Baines opened the event noting that participants would discuss cognitive warfare and new domain of competition, where state and non-state actors aim to influence what people think and how they act. The NAOC president also happily noted the lucrative opportunities for Canadian companies that this NATO Innovation Challenge promised. NATO researcher describes cognitive warfare as ways of harming the brain. The October 5th panel kicked off with François du Cluzel, a former French military officer who in 2013 helped to create the NATO Innovation Hub, which he has since then managed from its base in Norfolk, Virginia. Although the iHub insists on its website, for legal reasons, that the opinions expressed on this platform don't constitute NATO or any other organization's points of views, the organization is sponsored by the Allied Command Transformation, ACT, described as one of two strategic commands at the head of NATO's military command structure. The Innovation Hub, therefore, acts as a kind of in-house NATO research center or think tank. Its research is not necessarily official NATO policy, but it is directly supported and overseen by NATO. In 2020, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, SACT, tasked du Cluzel as manager of the iHub to conduct a 6-month study on cognitive warfare. Du Cluzel summarized his research in the panel this October. He initiated his remarks noting that cognitive warfare right now is one of the hottest topics for NATO and has become a recurring term in military terminology in recent years. Although French, du Cluzel emphasized that cognitive warfare strategy is being currently developed by my command here in Norfolk, USA. The NATO Innovation Hub manager spoke with a PowerPoint presentation and opened with a provocative slide that described cognitive warfare as a battle for the brain. Cognitive warfare is a new concept that starts in the information sphere. That is a kind of hybrid warfare, du Cluzel said. It starts with hyperconnectivity. Everyone has a cell phone, he continued. It starts with information because information is, if I may say, the fuel of cognitive warfare. But it goes way beyond solely information, which is a standalone operation. Information warfare is a standalone operation. Cognitive warfare overlaps with big tech corporations and mass surveillance because it's all about leveraging the big data, du Cluzel explained. We produce data everywhere we go, every minute, every second we go online. And this is extremely easy to leverage those data in order to better know you and use that knowledge to change the way you think. Naturally, the NATO researcher claimed foreign adversaries are the supposed aggressors employing cognitive warfare. But at the same time, he made it clear that the Western military alliance is developing its own tactics. Du Cluzel defined cognitive warfare as the art of using technologies to alter the cognition of human targets. Those technologies, he noted, incorporate the fields of NBIC, nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science. Altogether, it makes a kind of very dangerous cocktail that can further manipulate the brain, he said. Du Cluzel went on to explain that the exotic new method of attack goes well beyond information warfare or psychological operations, or as we commonly know them as PSYOPs. Cognitive warfare is not only a fight against what we think, but it's rather a fight against the way we think. If we can change the way people think, he said, it's much more powerful and it goes way beyond the information warfare and PSYOPs. Du Cluzel continued, it's crucial to understand that it's a game on our cognition, on the way our brain processes information and turns it into knowledge, rather than solely a game on information or on psychological aspects of our brains. It's not only an action against what we think, but also an action against the way we think, the way we process information and turn it into knowledge. In other words, cognitive warfare is not just another word, another name for information warfare. It is a war on our individual processor, our brain. The NATO researcher stressed that this is extremely important for us in the military because it has the potential, by developing new weapons and ways of harming the brain, it has the potential to engage neuroscience and technology in many, many different approaches to influence human ecology. Because you all know that it's very easy to turn a civilian technology into a military one. As for who the targets of cognitive warfare could be, Duke Luzel revealed that anyone and everyone is on the table. Cognitive warfare has universal reach, from starting with the individual to states and multinational organizations, he said. Its field of action is global and aimed to seize control of the human being, civilian as well as military. And the private sector has a financial interest in advancing cognitive warfare research, he noted. The massive worldwide investments made in neurosciences suggest that the cognitive domain will probably be one of the battlefields of the future. The development of the cognitive warfare totally transforms military conflict as we know it, Duke Luzel said, adding a third major combat dimension to the modern battlefield. To the physical and informational dimension is now added a cognitive dimension. This creates a new space of competition beyond what is called the 5 domains of operations, or land, sea, air, cyber, and space domains. Warfare in the cognitive arena mobilizes a wider range of battle spaces than solely the physical and information dimensions can do. In short, humans themselves are the new contested domain in this novel mode of hybrid warfare, alongside land, sea, air, cyber, and outer space. NATO's cognitive warfare study warns of embedded fifth column. The study that NATO Innovation Hub Manager Francois Duke Luzel conducted from June to November 2020 was sponsored by the Military Cartel's Allied Command Transformation and published as a 45-page report in January 2021. The chilling document shows how contemporary warfare has reached a kind of dystopian stage, once imaginable only in science fiction. The nature of warfare has changed, the report emphasized. The majority of current conflicts remain below the threshold of the traditionally accepted definition of warfare. But new forms of warfare have emerged, such as cognitive warfare, while the human mind is now being considered as a new domain of war. For NATO, research on cognitive warfare is not just defensive. It is very much offensive as well. Developing capabilities to harm the cognitive abilities of opponents will be a necessity, Duke Luzel's report stated clearly. In other words, NATO will need to get the ability to safeguard her decision-making process and disrupt the adversary's one. And anyone could be a target of these cognitive warfare operations. Any user of modern information technologies is a potential target. It targets the whole of a nation's human capital, the report ominously added, as well as a potential execution of a cognitive war to complement to a military conflict. It can also be conducted alone, without any link to an engagement of the armed forces, the study went on. Moreover, cognitive warfare is potentially endless, since there can be no peace treaty or surrender for this type of conflict. Just as this new mode of battle has no geographic borders, it also has no time limit. This battlefield is global via the internet, with no beginning and no end. This conquest knows no respite, punctuated by notifications from our smartphones anywhere, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The NATO-sponsored study noted that some NATO nations have already acknowledged that neuroscientific techniques and technologies have high potential for operational use in a variety of security, defense, and intelligence enterprises. It spoke of breakthroughs in neuroscientific methods and technologies, NeuroST, and said uses of research findings and products to directly facilitate the performance of combatants, the integration of human-machine interfaces to optimize combat capabilities of semi-autonomous vehicles, like drones, and development of biological and chemical weapons, or neuroweapons. The Pentagon is among the primary institutions advancing this novel research, as the report highlighted. Although a number of nations have pursued and are currently pursuing neuroscientific research and development for military purposes, perhaps the most proactive efforts in this regard have been conducted by the United States Department of Defense, with most notable and rapidly maturing research and development conducted by DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity. So, the dual-headed snake of DARPA and IARPA. Military uses of NeuroST research, the study indicated, include intelligence gathering, training, optimizing performance, and resilience in combat and military support personnel, and, of course, direct weaponization of neuroscience and neurotechnology. This weaponization of NeuroST can and will be fatal. The NATO-sponsored study was clear to point out. The research can be utilized to mitigate aggression and foster cognitions and emotions of affiliation or passivity, induce morbidity, disability, or suffering, and neutralize potential opponents or incur mortality. In other words, to maim and kill people. A 2020 NATO-sponsored study on cognitive warfare. The report quoted U.S. Major General Robert H. Scales, who summarized NATO's new combat philosophy. Victory will be defined more in terms of capturing the psychocultural rather than the geographical high ground. And as NATO developed tactics of cognitive warfare to capture the psychocultural, it is also increasingly weaponizing various scientific fields. The study spoke of the crucible of data sciences and human sciences, and stressed that the combination of social sciences and system engineering will be key in helping military analysts to improve the production of intelligence. If kinetic power cannot defeat the enemy, it said, psychology and related behavioral and social sciences stand to fill the void. Leveraging social sciences will be central to the development of the human domain plan of operations, the report went on. It will support the combat operations by providing potential courses of action for the whole surrounding human environment, including enemy forces, but also determining key human elements such as the cognitive center of gravity, the desired behavior as the end state. All academic disciplines will be implicated in cognitive warfare, not just the hard sciences. Within the military, expertise on anthropology, ethnography, history, psychology, among other areas, will be more than ever required to cooperate with the military, the NATO-sponsored study stated. The report nears its conclusion with an eerie quote. Today's progresses in nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science, NBIC, boosted by the seemingly unstoppable march of a triumphant troika made of artificial intelligence, big data, and civilizational digital addiction, have created a much more ominous prospect, an embedded fifth column, where everyone, unbeknownst to him or her, is behaving according to the plans of one of our competitors. The modern concept of war is not about weapons, but about influence, it posited. Victory in the long run will remain solely dependent on the ability to influence, affect, change, or impact the cognitive domain. The NATO-sponsored study then closed with a final paragraph that makes it clear beyond doubt that the Western military alliance's ultimate goal is not only physical control of the planet, but also control over people's minds. Cognitive warfare may well be the missing element that allows a transition from military victory on the battlefield to lasting political success. The human domain might well be the decisive domain, wherein multi-domain operations achieve the common commander's effect. The first 5 domains can give tactical and operational victories. Only the human domain can achieve the final and full victory. Canadian Special Operations Officer emphasizes importance of cognitive warfare. When Francois du Cluzel, the NATO researcher who conducted the study on cognitive warfare, concluded his remarks in the October 5th NATO Association of Canada panel, he was followed by Andy Bonvie, a commanding officer at the Canadian Special Operations Training Centre. With more than 30 years of expertise with the Canadian Armed Forces, Bonvie spoke of how Western militaries are making use of research by du Cluzel and others, and incorporating novel cognitive warfare techniques into their combat activities. Cognitive warfare is a new type of hybrid warfare for us, Bonvie said, and it means we need to look at the traditional thresholds of conflict and how the things that are being done are really below those thresholds of conflict, cognitive attacks, and non-kinetic forms and non-combative threats to us. We need to understand these attacks better and adjust their actions and our training according to be able to operate in these different environments. Although he portrayed NATO's actions as defensive, claiming adversaries were using cognitive warfare against them, Bonvie was unambiguous about the fact that Western militaries are developing these techniques themselves to maintain a tactical advantage. We cannot lose the tactical advantage for our troops that we're placing forward, as it spans not only tactically but strategically, he said. Some of these different capabilities that we have, that we enjoy all of a sudden, could be pivoted to be used against us. So we have to better understand how quickly our adversaries adapt to these things, and then be able to predict where they're going in the future, to help us be and maintain the tactical advantage for our troops moving forward. Cognitive warfare is the most advanced form of manipulation seen to date. Marie-Pierre Raymond, a retired Canadian lieutenant colonel who currently serves as a defense scientist and innovation portfolio manager for the Canadian Armed Forces Innovation for Defense Excellence and Security Program, also joined the October 5th panel. Long gone are the days when war was fought to acquire more land, Raymond said. Now the new objective is to change the adversary's ideologies, which makes the brain the center of gravity of the human, and it makes the human the contested domain, and the mind becomes a battlefield. When we speak about hybrid threats, cognitive warfare is the most advanced form of manipulation seen to date, she added, noting that it aims to influence individuals' decision-making and to influence a group of individuals on their behavior, with the aim of gaining a tactical or strategic advantage. Raymond noted that the cognitive warfare also heavily overlaps with artificial intelligence, big data, and social media, and reflects the rapid evolution of neurosciences as a tool of war. Raymond is helping to oversee the NATO Fall 2021 Innovation Challenge on behalf of Canada's Department of National Defence, which delegated management responsibilities to the military's Innovation for Defense Excellence and Security Program, where she works. In a highly technical jargon, Raymond indicated that the cognitive warfare program is not solely defensive, but also offensive. This challenge is calling for a solution that will support NATO's nascent human domain and jumpstart the development of a cognition ecosystem within the alliance, and that will support the development of new applications, new systems, new tools and concepts leading to concrete action in the cognitive domain. She emphasized that this will require sustained cooperation between allies, innovators, and researchers to enable our troops to fight and win in the cognitive domain. This is what we are hoping to emerge from this call to innovators and researchers. To inspire corporate interest in the NATO Innovation Challenge, Ramon enticed. Applicants will receive national and international exposure and cash prizes for the best solution. She then added, tantalizingly, this could also benefit the applicants by potentially providing them access to a market of 30 nations. Canadian military officer calls on the corporations to invest in NATO's cognitive warfare research. The other institution that is managing the Fall 2021 NATO Innovation Challenge on behalf of Canada's Department of National Defence is the Special Operations Forces Command. A Canadian military officer who works with the CANSOFCOM, Shekhar Ghati, was the final panelist in the October 5th NATO Association of Canada event. Ghati serves as CANSOFCOM's Innovation Officer for Southern Ontario. He concluded the event appealing for corporate investment in NATO's cognitive warfare research. The biannual Innovation Challenge is part of the NATO battle rhythm, Ghati declared enthusiastically. He noted that, in the spring of 2021, Portugal held a NATO Innovation Challenge focused on warfare in outer space. In spring 2020, the Netherlands hosted a NATO Innovation Challenge focused on COVID-19. Ghati reassured corporate investors that NATO will bend over backwards to defend their bottom lines. I can assure everyone that the NATO Innovation Challenge indicates that all innovators will maintain complete control of their intellectual property. So NATO won't take control of that. Neither will Canada. Innovators will maintain their control over their IP. The comment was a fitting conclusion to the panel, affirming that the NATO and its allies and in the military-industrial complex not only seek to dominate the world and the human rights that inhabit it with unsettling cognitive warfare techniques, but to also ensure the corporations and their shareholders continue to profit from these imperial endeavors. So there you have it. A little bit of a long read, but nonetheless, a little bit of insight as to the inner workings and where they're headed innovation-wise, if you want to call it that. The war on for your mind. Perhaps somebody like Alex Jones has been a bit ahead of his time yet again with InfoWars. As funny as that may sound, but nonetheless, it's absolutely true, and you would literally have no way of knowing that your thoughts are being manipulated. How would you prove that? How would you even take something like that in the event war were declared or undeclared on you or a populace? How would you take that into court and prove it? Talk about mind control, holy cow. So that leads into this next piece here as well, and that is this, says it's the science of propaganda is still being developed and advanced. Edward Bernays lives on, yes. So this by Caitlin Johnson over at Medium the other day says, we live in a far less free society than most of us think. It looks like we're free. We don't get thrown in prison for criticizing our government officials. We can vote for whoever we want. We can log on to the internet and look up information on any subject we're interested in. If we want to buy a product, we have many brands that we're free to choose from. But we're not free. Our political systems are set up to herd people into a two-party system that is controlled on both sides by plutocrats. The news media that people rely on to form ideas about what's going on and how they should vote are controlled by the plutocratic class and heavily influenced by secretive government agencies. Internet algorithms are aggressively manipulated to show people information which favors the status quo. Even our entertainment is rife with Pentagon and CIA influence. How free is that? How free is your speech if there are myriad institutional safeguards in place to prevent speech from ever affecting political change? It doesn't matter what you're allowed to say if it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter if you're allowed to call the oligarchic puppet put in office by the last fake election as a dickhead. It doesn't matter if you're allowed to Google any information you want, only to find whatever information Google wants you to find. What is the functional difference between a regime which directly censors the internet to prevent dissent and a regime which works with Silicon Valley plutocrats to control information via algorithms and has a system in place which prevents dissent from having any meaningful impact? There is none. Max Blumenthal says this: Canada's military relied on propaganda techniques similar to those employed during the Afghanistan War, shaping and exploiting info to head off civil disobedience by Canadians during the coronavirus pandemic and to bolster government messages. A little bit of a reference to the previous article here, that out of OttawaCitizen.com. It says we live in a profoundly unfree society that is disguised as a free society. Western liberal democracy is just totalitarianism dressed in drag. And it's only getting worse. Propaganda is a still developing science. Last month, Ottawa Citizen reported that the Canadian military used the COVID outbreak as an excuse to test actual military PSYOP techniques on its own civilian population under the pretense of assuring compliance with pandemic restrictions. In other words, lockdowns are good. You will obey. Some excerpts. Canadian military leaders saw the pandemic as a unique opportunity to test out propaganda techniques on an unsuspecting public, a newly released Canadian Forces report concludes. The plan devised by the Canadian Joint Operations Command, also known as CJOC, relied on propaganda techniques similar to those employed during the Afghanistan War. The campaign called for shaping and exploiting information. CJOC claimed the information operations scheme was needed to head off civilian disobedience by Canadians during the coronavirus pandemic and to bolster government messages about the pandemic. In other words, lockdown's good. Total 1984, right? A separate initiative not linked to the CJOC plan, but overseen by Canadian Forces intelligence officers, culled information from public social media accounts in Ontario. Data was also compiled on peaceful Black Lives Matter gatherings and BLM leaders. Peaceful protests. This is really a learning opportunity for all of us and a chance to start getting information operations into our CAF D&D routine, the Rear Admiral stated. Yet another review centered on the Canadian Forces Public Affairs branch and its activities. Last year, the branch launched a controversial plan that would have allowed military public affairs officers to use propaganda to change attitudes and behaviors of Canadians, as well as to collect and analyze information from public social media accounts. The plan would have seen staff move from traditional government methods of communicating with the public to a more aggressive strategy of using information warfare and influence tactics on Canadians. So they're not just employing mass-scale psychological operations on the public. They're testing them and learning from them. And we can probably assume that anything which may have been learned was also shared with the government agencies of other NATO members. And per the Gray Zone, says Western governments in the NATO military alliance are developing tactics of cognitive warfare, using the supposed threats of China and Russia to justify waging a battle for your brain in the human domain to make everyone a weapon. By Benjamin Norton. That's the article we just got done reading through. It says in a new article titled, Behind NATO's Cognitive Warfare, Western Militaries Are Waging a Battle for Your Brain, the Gray Zone's Ben Norton reports on how recent NATO-sponsored discussions have explicitly advocated the need to advance the science of cognitive warfare for offensive as well as defensive purposes. And some excerpts. NATO is spinning out an entirely new kind of combat it has branded as cognitive warfare, described as the weaponization of brain sciences. The new method involves hacking the individual by exploiting the vulnerabilities of the human brain in order to implement more sophisticated social engineering. While the NATO-backed study insisted that much of its research on cognitive warfare is designed for defensive purposes, it also conceded that the military alliance is developing offensive tactics, stating, "The human is very often the main vulnerability, and it should be acknowledged in order to protect NATO's human capital, but also to be able to benefit from our adversaries' vulnerabilities." In a chilling disclosure, the report stated explicitly that the objective of cognitive warfare is to harm societies and not only the military. The study described this phenomena as the militarization of brain science, but it appears clear that NATO's development of cognitive warfare will lead to a militarization of all aspects of human society and psychology, from the most intimate of social relationships to the mind itself. In other words, this document shows that figures in the NATO military cartel increasingly see their own domestic population as a threat, fearing civilians to be potential Chinese or Russian sleeper cells, dastardly fifth columns that challenge the stability of Western liberal democracies. Naturally, the NATO researcher claimed foreign adversaries are the supposed aggressors employing cognitive warfare. But at the same time, he made it clear that the Western military alliance is developing its own tactics. And here we see Bean hashtag drop the charges. States as in 1917, a young Edward Bernays was asked to help the American war effort by applying his uncle Sigmund Freud's theories of the unconscious to a new German technique called propaganda. Thus began the current war. The War on Sense-Making, another good article. It says in a 2017 essay titled The War on Sense-Making, writer Jordan Greenhall made an observation that I have thought about ever since. That the science of modern propaganda has been in research and development for more than a century now, and has necessarily advanced scientifically just as much as other fields in the military have. In 1917, a young Edward Bernays was asked to help the American war effort by applying his uncle Sigmund Freud's theories of the unconscious to a new German technique called propaganda. Greenhall writes, "The technology of war moves quickly. In the span of 1.5 centuries, the last war leapt from long rifles to repeating rifles to Gatling guns all the way to little boy. The war fighters of the current war haven't dawdled. The wars of culture, meaning, and purpose have seen innovations on an exponential technology curve. The artisanal efforts of Bernays and Goebbels have been left far in the past by modern methods. Think about how many technological advancements there have been in the military over the last century. Our rulers have been refining their methods of manipulating our sense-making abilities to their advantage throughout that entire time. And only a small minority of us have ever even begun to realize that the manipulation is even happening. We're just learning to play checkers while they're mastering 3D chess. I don't have any solutions to this problem other than to spread consciousness of the fact that it is happening. Propaganda only works if you don't understand A, that it is happening to you, and B, how it is occurring, and a basic awareness of the fact that there's a globe-spanning campaign to manipulate human thought to the advantage of the powerful is the first step toward having that understanding. Having the humility to understand that you yourself can be manipulated and deceived is the second step. My hope is that humanity will transcend its psychological susceptibility to manipulation and move into a healthy relationship with mental narrative as our adapt or die precipice draws nearer. But time will only tell. So an interesting piece there, kind of a tag along onto the first piece here, but right along the same lines, that the propaganda, misinformation, disinformation campaigns continue. And I think many of us have seen that play out as COVID has rolled along. And it's just finally admitted, at least, that at least in Canada, we know that it's being targeted on its own populace. What's to say it's not being done here in these United States or in the UK or take your pick, any one of these operations. You want to talk about MK Ultra on a population? This is it, right? So nonetheless, I wanted to bring that to your attention, get it out there, and hopefully you've found it rather enlightening. Appreciate the share, like, subscribe, pass it along to everybody you know, and I'll see you back on the next one. Take care. God bless everybody.